Oh, hello again. This is Philip at thebest3d.com, and what I'd like to do in this quick tutorial is a walkthrough, sort of a beginner's level introduction to storing images, storing brushes, storing selection masks, storing a number of things, even animations. You may have seen this in a number of tutorials, and perhaps this is a sort of a new concept. It's a little bit different from what you see in many other paint programs or 2D or 3D programs. And essentially what it means is that whenever you're working with something or on something, whether you just messed it up or you have a way to undo, or go to the undo browser and see some of the prior versions of the artwork, you can see sometimes the need to quickly set aside a copy of this, right? Not saving it necessarily on the hard drive on disk, but at least have it sort of in memory as a quick save, quick put it aside, storing it, right? And so many of the resources that we work with we are able to store so that we can later get back to them or do something else with it. In this example, for instance, here I have a rendering that was created, and maybe it was created with, in fact, it was created with Puppy Ray. And let's say I want to use this image, but I want to do some other stuff first, and I want to be able to get back to that. So storing an image, you can find this shortcut right up here, and that will store the image right there. Right, so that's a little stored copy. You have that also under the image menu, store image copy. Now what it does is it doesn't grab just the image, it also grabs the selection mask. Now everything is selected, so the whole mask is, the whole image, RGB and alpha is stored. When you click on it, let's say if you mess this up or you erase it, when you click here, it will simply restore the red, green, blue, but you do have some extra options. You do have some things like restoring the alpha. You have a couple of other options. Sometimes you want just the blue, the green, or the red channel, so you can do some selective restoration from that. So let me get you another example. If I did actually have some sort of a selection mask, something like this, and I wanted to store the whole thing, I store it. You don't see the fact that it has the alpha here, but it does have it too. If I clear the selection, if I clear the red, green, blue, and I click the stored image here, all it does, it restores the red, green, blue, but if I want, I can also restore or replace the alpha. So that one was also stored with it. And there are a couple of other things that you can see doing with that. One of them is to combine with a different image, right? And so sometimes you go here and say, let's go and combine it with something like a multiply mode or screen mode and so on. So explore this. There are a lot of features, a lot of ways to use this stored image, even just using it as a color picker. Right here, you can turn this into a dynamic color palette. So now, as you're dragging inside this image, this stored copy, you can see it's changing the color of the primary color here with the left button, and with the right button, it's changing right here the secondary color. All right. So that's when you turn this into a color picker. Toggle it back off, and it's a regular stored image that can be used to restore whatever you have here. All right, there are other things you can do with it too. You can actually take this image and use it as a brush, right? Use as brush. And plus the alpha, with the alpha. So the selection mask will be in the brush too, and that's certainly one of the most typical scenarios. If you look under the brush, you can store and manage the brush as well. So now you have that selection, that image with the mask in the brush. And let's say if you clear the selection and you clear the image, you still have this now in the brush, and you can paint with that. Right? You can stamp it down, you can paint with it. And so that's another thing you can store. You can store images, and that's done here very quickly with this shortcut. There's another thing you can store, and that's to store the brush. Right? So whatever your current brush is, let's say you go and pick two rectangular regions here. You do a rectangle like this, and then you do another one like this, but you want to add them together, so you do a shift. Use the shift to add the two selections together, and now you like to pick that up as a custom brush. There's a couple of ways to do that. One is to simply go to the brush and say use selected as brush, right? The selection, this selected set of pixels, this region is going to be used as a brush. Another way to use that is to use this custom brush selection tool right here, custom brush selector tool, and you can then give it a little bit of margin and say how much of that really you want. You don't necessarily need to be cutting off the edges, but if you want, you could certainly do that. But what we just did now here is we grabbed this as a custom brush. We can see it here. Let me go and erase to a different color. Something like plain white or something like that. Okay, so if I erase there, so this is the brush right now. I can change the opacity of it to be a bit more intense, more opaque. I can do a couple of things with such a brush. I can also add some post effects under the settings here for the brush. Let's pin this down. You'll notice that you have some effects tab here for the custom brushes, and you can enable that, for instance, to do a shadow, so that it drops a shadow every time that you stamp it or draw it. Right. Now, if you want the shadow to actually be in the brush itself, you can do that under the brush menu and add a drop shadow. There you go. And so now each brush stamp, each brush image has that shadow applied to it. It's now actually stored, and you can add that as another store and manage a copy of that. So you have two. You have this new brush here that contains the shadow already built into it. All right, so that's a good reason to work with brushes, is to store them and then do a variety of things. Let's say the stored copy here, you want it a little bit smaller, you can say let's do that. You want to have it perhaps rotate a little bit, you can do that. You can also have it rotate, of course, with the movement. So as you're drawing, first of all, you can preview it. You can enable the preview here for the brush. You can also have it follow and rotate and do all sorts of things relative to the path that you're drawing. You can even have it change size in a post effects here under the view post correction. That one will change the size of the brush if you enable it, so it doesn't stay this size. When you let go, it redraws it, and you see how it's getting smaller. If you want it to go smaller faster, maybe in a linear way, you do this, and so you see that it's going to be gradually getting smaller here. You can make it go smaller and then bigger again and smaller. So all sorts of different effects can be happening along that path. And you see it's big, it gets small, it gets big again, it gets small and gets big just one last time before it goes down to very small. So that's working with brushes, and so that's another good reason. With brushes, with images, you want to have them stored. With brushes, you want to have them stored so you can easily get back to them. You can easily work with them. You can change the saturation, the hue. You can make them look very different in appearance. Right? You can also work on the red, green, blue channel individually. And so that's with storing brushes. We have stored images, we have stored brushes. What else can we store? Well, we have this one here, that's the image, that's the brush, and in the middle, in between, we have the selection. So we can also store a selection. Now, right now, this one here doesn't seem to have a particular selection. Actually, everything is selected, so everything can be stored, and there it is. I have a stored copy of the alpha. The alpha channel is what holds your selection, and you can actually do a number of things with this too. You can paint right in there. You can say you want to paint in here with the right button, with the left button, and so on. Different sizes for these dabs, and then you can invert it. Let's say if we invert it, we will have all these black regions turn into a non-selected area, and the white pixels here will be fully selected. Right? So if we replace the alpha, we now have a mask that is dictated or controlled by this selection that we had stored. And we can always do the opposite too, right? If we start from something like this, we clear, let me hide the brush, let me clear the selection. Let's say we do something with the two, let's say an ellipse, we draw one selection here, and then we draw another one, but with the shift key, maybe another one here and another one here, and then maybe also a few that connect between them, some ovals, something like this. So we have a selection mask. With the control, you can shift it around. Just press and hold the control key so you can position it where you want it. And let's say you want to grab this selection, simply go here on that stored copy and say get alpha. Now you have a stored copy right there. If you needed that separately, you can always go right here Right? That's the shortcut, store selection, there you go. And another option, of course, under the selection menu, store selection. Right? So it's very consistent between storing an image, you have a store image copy. Storing a brush, you have store and manage copy. Why not just call it store? Well, because we manage and do a bit more work with it. Right? You can minimize it to keep it aside here, but still handily available. Just click and you can start painting with it. But more importantly, you can also change the color, the appearance in many different ways. Right? The size. Now, back to the selection mask. You can also have the selection do a number of things, including being blurred, right? So if I want that transition not to be such a sharp, crisp edge, but I want to actually have some sort of a smooth transition on that selection mask, I can blur it. I can go to the Gaussian blur selection and do something like this, and now I have a bit of a transition. Right? Let's say if I erase it, you see that better now. You see a sort of a transition there. And the purple is only showing because I have the selection indicate an overlay. That's the purple. If I turn that off, you don't see it. You still see the marching ants, and that's also something you can get rid of. You don't have to show it. Sometimes it's slowing you down, so turn it off if you want. But it is there, and so as you paint, you will see that it's preventing or allowing the paint to come in. So that's the task, the purpose of the selection mask. I'm going to keep the marching ants and the overlay. Sometimes I disable the marching ants when there are just too many of them, and it's taking time or confusing and just like loading the image with too many of these. But it's good to have the purple appearance in the overlay mode. And then that way you have a mask that you might want to store as well. So I have this one here with the crisp selection, and I could go with another copy here, store selection, or as you remember here, this shortcut, store selection. So now I have two selections that are stored. And again, this is something that you can work with. You can, for instance, combine one with the other, not in their stored instance, but basically saying, okay, whatever is back here, you want to add that to what you have here, or you want to subtract it. Okay, so for instance, if I load this one, right, let's go replace, that's the one that's in here now. That's the selection with the smooth transition. And then I'm going to go to this one and subtract it. What happens is that I have a short region, a very thin range where we still have some partial selection. But in between, in the middle here, this was the same as it was over here. So both of these had the same selection on the inside, the same selection on the outside. There is only a difference along the edge where we blurred this one, whereas this one was a crisp. And so by doing this, let me do that even more. Let me replace this one and blur it even some more. Let me go to the selection. This time I'm going to use the box filter selection. And you see a very strong blurry transition here. In fact, you can show it as an alpha. You can show the alpha as a sort of a grayscale, black and white. And then what we'll do is we'll get this alpha. So we now have this very blurry mask, and we have this very crisp original mask. And so I'm going to use this. I'm going to say put this one in. Oh, it's already in. We don't have to. But now I'm going to say subtract this one. All right. So now you have, and in fact, if I store this alpha, you can now see that basically it shows the glow or the region around the common selection. Right? When you subtract one from the other, whatever is the same is going to go black, going to go away. And the only thing you'll end up seeing is where there is a difference, right? Where the first one was bigger than the second one that you subtracted from the first. So you essentially can create some really interesting shapes with that too. For instance, if you were to increase the contrast of this selection, right? Let me go and clear the background. We still have that selection showing, and what I'd like to do is now go to the selection and adjust the selection with regard to the contrast, right? So I can make it a little bit more pervasive there, a little bit brighter, a little bit more visible. But I want to make sure that there we go, look at that. We can basically have it a full transition enabled or disabled. Not quite fully there yet, but you know where I'm going with this. Basically to create some dramatic new shapes that are resulting from subtracting prior shapes, right? I have a selection, and now I have a subtraction and a very high contrast version of that. All right, so that's hopefully showing you the benefits of storing a variety of assets, right? Images, storing a selection mask. Let me go get this one, get alpha. And you know, sometimes you have no selection mask yet, and you'd like to use an image and turn that into a selection mask. Let me go and minimize this. I don't know if we'll need to get back to that, but let's say we start with an image like this one, and in fact this one here, right? So, and we say this is the image, but I'd like to start turning that into a selection mask. One way you can do that is to say, well, even if you don't have a selection mask yet, you can simply store the current one, because there is always a selection, right? Either nothing is selected, or everything is selected, or something specific is selected. Let's see, something like this, right? Well, regardless of what's there, you can always start by storing that current selection, and then ignore what's there and say, no, get the image. Put the image in here. Now you have the image as a grayscale inside that selection mask. Then you can replace that into the alpha, and it is now your selection mask. All right, so that's an interesting two-step process to get the image into the alpha channel. There's actually a couple of other ways to do that too. If you look at the image menu, you could say alpha, swap image to alpha. Now this is the main image, so you would first need to get the current image here from the main buffer into the swap buffer. So swap image, copy to the swap image. You don't see it, but if you toggle here, you can toggle between the two. It's now the same image because we just copied the main into the swap. And you can see, if I click it, you can see the swap here. If I click it back, you're back on the main. You're looking at the main image, but we know the swap image has a copy of it. So under the image menu, we can go and say alpha, copy swap image to alpha. And voila, now we have that same image inside the alpha channel, inside your selection mask. All right, so that's one of many reasons, many ways to use this, right? You can store an image, you can store a brush and then use it. You can store a variety of items. You can store a selection, and there is at least one or two more things you can store as you work with them. And one of them is an animation, right? So let's say you're creating an animation and you want that animation to be available for quick restoration, to quickly use it again for something else, or if you change your mind and you want to try something different, like a different filter. Let's say, for instance, we do an animation, let's say of just 30 frames. Let's go create an animation. It's all blank, right? It has nothing in there initially. All images are identical, but I'm gonna do an animation with this brush that moves it along this path. The way to do that is to have it at least contain two images. Right now this only has one image, right? You can see here the film strip only shows one image. In fact, it's not even the purple one or the pink one, it's that original blue teal one. But we did change the hue, the saturation and colors, as you recall. What I'd like to do really is add the same one again. Right? And in fact, it might be different because this one's the blue, this one's the purple. If I add it, I now have two. I have a smaller purple or pink one, and then I have the original blue one. The point is that we now have two brushes, and they're appearing differently, like the blue one or this purple one turns yellow because of the additional transformation. But the point is we have an animated brush. The animated brush can be rendered into an animation very simply with just the Alt key. I press the Alt key and it's now rendering this across the animation. All frames of the animation here have been receiving my brush stamps or brush strokes. So if I clear, let's say if I right click here to clear all frames and I do a little animation like this, eventually it recycles. I reach the beginning again, and I can keep going, and I have a really wacky animation here. But let's say that's exactly the wackiness I wanted. I wanted this little animation here. All right. So what do I do? Well, I'll do a number of things with it, but I may want to get back to this original. All right. So the thing to do is you go to the animation and you store. Just like you stored images, or you stored brushes, or you stored selections, you can also store an image. Excuse me, you can store an animation. Now, an animation is quite memory intensive. Right? So sometimes it's okay to store that in memory, and that's one of the options you see here, store to memory. And that's almost instantaneous. It's very fast. So you have a stored copy, and if you mess this up, Easy peasy, you just click this and it restores it. Now it restores this and it also clears the alpha channel. If you look here in the back, there's nothing. No, excuse me, not this one, the alpha, the swap image, right? So the swap image is cleared when you restore the stored animation. When you click on this, because for instance, if I go here and I paint something in the swap image, let's say this, right, and then I swap it back, you see here I'm on the frame, I'm in the main image, on the first frame, second frame, and so on. In the swap, I still have this image, right? But if I restore it, this animation restored, the swap image is cleared. All right, keep that in mind. All right, so why would we store animations? Well, because we want to get back to it without having to recreate it all, right? This may be an animation of, I don't know, a little video clip or an image sequence, something you rendered in Carrara or some other animation tools, and it may be 2D or 3D, or it may be something you created here, and you want to get back to it so you can quickly experiment with other effects, other filters. Let me take an example. Let's say I'm going to go and render the animated sky. Where is it? There, render sky. And I'm going to go and actually animate this, right? So I'm going to click animate and say, yeah, let's move a little bit to the side, a little bit forward, and make it change quite a bit. So now these clouds are being rendered with some animation on them as they are moving in some direction and also undergoing some transformation in the Z space of the fractal algorithm. So what we have here, actually I don't know if it's fractal or Gaussian or noise or something like that, but we have a little animation. And of course we'd like to experiment with that, maybe make it smaller, slower, maybe turn it a little bit darker, higher contrast, that sort of things, maybe a reverse, right? So what we'll do is we'll store the animation there. And as long as we have plenty of memory, we can do that in memory. This one we can easily restore. There you go. This one we can easily restore. And there it is. All right. So we have a way to work with this, just like we did with images, with brushes, with selections. When you have an animation that you think you might need again and again and quickly get back to it, one easy way to do that is you store it. All right, so let's say, for instance, we restore this one, and then we want to make it go in the opposite direction. There's a right click on this. You can say reverse frames. There you go. So now the image sequence goes in the opposite direction. Another thing you might want to do with that is perhaps time stretch it, make it go a little bit slower, all right, or faster. Let's say I want to double the number of frames with frame blending. And so now we have a new image sequence that is half the speed, or the clouds appear to be moving half the speed. It's actually twice as long with the same content with frame blending in between. And that's one of many ways to create this, and that's something we may want to store too. So here we go. Now sometimes you're running low on memory, and it's a good idea to actually go to the disk. It will do that. If it runs out of memory, it will actually tell you. But you see, it takes significantly longer. Especially me, I have a fairly old computer. It's very fragmented, and also the disk drive is not very fast. If you do this, I recommend you use an SSD drive. When you store something on like an animation on the disk, it'll be so much faster, right? But at any rate, you have one you can restore here, and that goes this way. Then you can restore this one. Simply click it. Now there's a couple of other things you can do. You can store this in. You can transfer that to a brush. You have a little pull-down menu to say use as animated brush. So now I have an animated brush inside I have this sky inside my brush. Maybe I want to make this thing a little bit shorter step distance. Also get rid of the rotation. So now I have the brush in here, and I can store that brush, store the brush, and I can also make it smaller. And it makes every frame smaller, right? It takes a little bit longer there. Be careful with that. So now I have the whole animation inside my brush. Right. And that's something you use if you want to do paint animations on top of animation. Let's say you do the transform again, and it does this. So let's store or restore the longer animation, and then use the Alt key to paint the animated sky inside the other animate. So animation on top of animation, right? So a lot of wacky stuff you can do with that, but it's very controllable too. So let's say, what else would we do with these animations, right? Well, for instance, you would throw filters at them, right? You would say, for instance, I need a filter where I change the color, add some color or subtract some color, where there's a little bit more red at the beginning, or maybe less of it. And then as the sun sets down, you'll have more of it and it gets darker. So initially you might be a little bit brighter, something like this, something like that, right? And keyframe it, and then you'll go down to about this much with more red and less of the other tone, something like this, and then eventually it will all go black or very dark, right? Something like this maybe. All right, and there you go. So you apply filters across this, and then you realize that that's cool, but it's not exactly what I needed. Let me redo that. So a couple of ways to do it is, if you had this checked here, save undo, you can now undo, right? And the other way to restore it, of course, is simply click on this, the stored copy, and that's why we store things. Occasionally it's nice to have a quick access to restore it from there. Right, other things you can do with a stored copy is combine it, right? You can use it as an animated selection, right? Or you can use it as an animated swap. Let me do this. I'm going to use it as the swap image. So now as I'm scrubbing through that, you see the same image in the swap. In other words, if you now do something else with the currently loaded animation, let's say I'm blurring it. Let's go blur, Gaussian blur, something like this, right? And animate that across the entire sequence. That animation is blurred. The one that's stored here that I'm using in the swap is not. So these are two separate animations. And in fact, I'm going to go and store this one too. Animation to, let's go to memory. Let's be adventurous here. And so I have two animations. This one is being used as animated swap. This one is not. And what I can do is I can combine the two. This one is same duration, same number of frames, same size, but this one here is rather blurry. And what I can do is I can combine the two, right? Because you have some filters like animated, right here, combine with swap, right? The swap is coming from this stored image. The current loaded image is here with the blurry content. No problem, we can combine the two. We can combine this blurry one with the other one that's crisp. And for instance, do a crisp transition here, right? See how it's blurry, showing you the main image, or crisp, showing you the swap image, right? Or other things you could do is combine them in different ways. Let's say divide or screen, or all sorts of funky things to apply. And then, for instance, here I'm combining the blurry with the crisp one and creating a new effect there. Let's say if I wanted to instead, let's restore this here, and instead I wanted to subtract them. Let's see what that does. Sometimes you get some really, it's time to experiment. You get some really interesting effects at times. Look at that transition. This one is very dark, so maybe I'd like to go and brighten it up now. Change dynamic range. So you see what it did. It found the difference as I subtracted one from the other, and you have just a totally different result coming out of that. So yet another example of where it pays to store these images, or store the animation in this case, because you can do a lot of things with it once it's stored. You can use it as the source of an image sequence to use against your other current image sequence, right? And selections just the same. You can have a selection mask that is animated. You can have a swap image that is animated, but even here you can use it as an animated selection. So the selection mask is going through this animation as well. All right, so I said there are a few other things you can store, and I wanted to point out at least one more. We have images, we have animations, we have brushes, and we have selections. Well, there are also curves. The curve tool here, when you look at the curve tool, you'll get, and I'm going to close the animation for now. I'm going to say, let's get rid of the animation and free it. And what you see here, when you're from the brush, when you go from the brush menu, from the brush tool down to the curve tool, you'll see an extra set of mini icons here. This is sort of the context dependent options bar. Context bar, we call it. So I'm going to go click on the curve tool, and you see it right here. So there's a lot of extra parameters and options. Let me go clear this to plain white. It's actually not exactly white. We must have a selection mask that prevented some of that. Let's go do this. There you go. All right. So what's the curve tool? Well, of course, if I use, let's say if I use a brush, let's say the regular airbrush, something like this. All right. I can paint it like this. Well, with the curve tool, I can instead put a couple of points together and then say paint it along that. Right. I can either render it right here, right? Stroke the brush along that, or here's the curve, and I say no, let's change it to a different shape, and I'd like to paint it, which means that it's simulating the pressure on your tablet if you have a tablet pen. So I have very thin entry, and then it goes to full size, and then go back to small. Well, it's following that curve, and you can change that curve, and at some point you may want to close it, or you may want to make it a crisp edge, and all of these things you might occasionally want to store. Right? Not the result of it, not the pixels that you get by painting, or let's say by filling. There's a fill option too. Not that. What you want to store is the curve, right? And so to do that, you simply use one of the options that you have right in here. You see these options here are for editing. You can move points, you can delete, you can do a couple of other things, and then there is an option for the free transform of a curve. Right? The free transform of a curve is very powerful too. I certainly encourage you to experiment with that. Every once in a while, you'll want to apply other things like all sorts of other effects you can apply on that curve. Set the fill settings, have a gradient fill. Right? So you could actually fill it. Under the fill settings here, you could say you want a gradient fill with horizontal, for instance. Right? So now it will take that curve and fill it horizontally. Well, the point is that this curve is something you will use again and again, and you may want to save them, but most importantly, you may want to store them as you work with it. Right? So store this curve, and voila, this is one of the tools that you will use again, because let's say you change it to a different curve, something like this, similar but different, and you can see the effect, or you can render along the edge and do all sorts of other things with it. Well, that curve you may want to store too, right? So here is another store curve. Boom, now we have two curves. You can restore this one, simply click this. You can restore this one, simply click this. Right? So this is how you can easily work with curves if you start storing some of them and working with them. For instance, while you set up some animated rotoscoping, there's a variety of things that you might want to even save. You can save your rotoscoping sequence. There's a variety of things to explore. I just wanted to focus on one thing here. There's a little tool here to grab and move the curve around, but most importantly, you can store it. And that really is part of all the many resources you can store. We can store images, this one here. You can store selections, this one here. Well, it's or brushes in this case here. You can store selections. This one is kind of plain. You can store animations if you have an animation. Right now I don't. But you can also store a curve if you're inside the curve tool. All right, and so as we explore, I'm sure we'll find other things worth storing, but those are the 5 key elements that you will want to be familiar with. Storing an image, storing a brush, which could contain an image or even a sequence of images, an animated brush, storing a selection mask in the alpha channel, storing the animation, and storing the curves from the curve tool. All right, that's it for this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.